thank you again for being here. We're really excited for today's Lunch and Learn on family engagement and hearing from our family engagement experts around how DCPS supports and does this important work. So without further ado, I will turn it over to my colleagues, Dimelza and Sophie.
Thank you, Abby. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us here today. I think there is maybe 5 people on the call. Hopefully more will trickle in. Because we're a small group, feel free to unmute yourself, contribute, ask questions throughout the presentation. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit more about family engagement and how that looks like at DCPS. And before we jump right into the meat of it, I want to make sure that we have a moment to pause and see how everyone's doing today. So next slide, thank you. So you can enter it in the chat or you can unmute yourself because we're a small group. Tell us, how are you doing today? Like which blob in the blob tree represents you? And I can go ahead as folks are looking at the different images on the blob tree. I feel like I am number 3 right now, towards the bottom of the trunk, where I am trying to, climb that tree and get up there, and I feel supported by my team. So, yeah, that's where I am. Anyone else would like to share, either in the chat or unmute yourself?
I would say I'm a 12 today because of our collaborative lunch and learn. And I'm just happy that we're, able to bring our teams together to give our partners this great content.
Yeah, I see that. Number 12. Yeah, thank you so much for having us, Abby and Kitty. Let's take one more person. Okay, I see some coming in the chat. Maybe number 6. There you go. And 11 and 12, yep. And let's take one more minute to see if something comes up in the chat. Oh goodness, I'm so sorry that you are feeling sick. Also fighting a cold. So I hear you with that. All right. So let's go ahead and continue on. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. Now that you've got a little bit warmed up in the chat, please let us know your name, your organization, and how you support students and families in DCPS. And while you do that, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Dimelza Gonzales-Flores. I'm the Family Engagement Specialist here at Central Services, and I've been at DCPS for 2.5 years. Prior to my time at DCPS, I worked in the nonprofit sector, and I was a partner of DCPS. I was working with an organization. There's a partner organization. So it's really great to be able to see, both sides of what this work looks like when it comes to serving families in DCPS. Prior to that, I was a teacher, and throughout my career, and more specifically now, a lot of the work that I do is making sure that families have the information and resources they need to be active partners in their child's education. And I'll kick it off to Sophie to introduce yourself as folks enter their introductions in the chat.
Thanks, Dimelza. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Sophie Hagan. I'm the Family Engagement Coordinator at Central Services in the same team with Dimelza. I've been at DCPS for 4 years. I am from DC, so this work is near and dear to me. I have always worked in education. I've spent some time in the classroom. I've spent some time in policy. And so it's great to be with folks like you today who are passionate about this work and about supporting families and students. In my current role, I work closely with Dimelza. We have a lot of overlapping projects. but I work especially closely with our teachers and our school staff to really build their confidence and their capacity when it comes to partnering with their students' families. So I do a lot of professional development, and we use a lot of the resources that we'll be sharing with you all today. So yeah, great to meet you all. And I'm seeing in the chat, people are sharing. We have Sabrina Rodriguez from Latino Student Fund, doing college prep with our most recently arrived first gen students. Awesome. Girls on the Run. Love Girls on the Run. I have a teacher that I know works really closely with her point at Malcolm X. Fishing school, we provide out-of-time academic enrichment to Title I schools in DC. That's awesome. This is awesome. This is really helpful for us to see where you all are coming from. We don't interface with I mean, I know Dimelza has that prior experience, but this is not an audience that I'm usually interacting with. So it's really great to meet you all and see how you're supporting our families from a different angle. Cool. Please keep on. Yes, Erica Liedel. That's who I work with at Malcolm X, and she's one of our amazing teacher facilitators. I work with her very closely. That's awesome. Cool. Let's move on. Okay, so our objective for today is pretty straightforward. We're just going to share our approach to family engagement at DCPS and some best practices and resources that you can hopefully incorporate into your program. So our agenda is as follows. So we're going to be sharing some frameworks with you first, our kind of grounding beliefs and principles when it comes to this work. We're going to do a mindset activity together. We'll share some best practices for ongoing communication with families. We'll talk you through a specific protocol that we use for reactive communication. And then we will highlight some resources and hopefully have some time for questions as well. So starting with our core beliefs at DCPS, so we have 4 core family engagement beliefs. The first one is the first 2 we wanted to highlight, especially for you all. The first being that our DCPS community extends beyond our school walls. So when we think about our community, we think about partners like you all. We think about all staff members, both in schools and at central office, all family members. We really think about it in a very inclusive way. And so when we're talking about engaging our community and our families, that means engaging you all and everyone else who's playing a role. We strongly believe that families are experts in their children and are partners in their success. And we believe that because we know that families are their child's first teachers. And so it's really important to be partnering with them and sharing power with them. The third one is the idea that we can't do this work in isolation, meaning that there are 3 of us on the family engagement team at Central Services. That certainly doesn't mean that we are the 3 people in DCPS doing family engagement. Family engagement is something that everyone does at DCPS, something that everyone is responsible for. And then the last one is really family engagement is equity work, right? By engaging all of our families, lifting up voices of families who, are not traditionally heard or have been marginalized, that is really, really important to our work. And so we really believe that family engagement is furthers equity in education. And so that's why it's so important to us at DCPS. So moving on. So we have these beliefs. Here's how we put them into action. So if we can build and sustain relationships with our entire DCPS community, including our families and you all and our staff, if we can increase access to information, if we can increase transparency to ensure that all of our stakeholders have equitable opportunities to advise DCPS priorities, and if we can build capacity internally in our schools, in central office, to partner with our families and community members, then we hopefully can further support our student success through these meaningful partnerships with our families and our communities. So this is our theory of action. If you have any questions along the way, we'll have some time allocated at the end, but feel free to pop them in the chat. Dimelza and Natalie joined. She leads our team, and so I know that they would be happy to chime in and answer any questions you have as I voice over the slides. So this is why is family engagement something that is a key priority at DCPS? Why is it something that we invest in? It's because we believe that if we are empowering and partnering with families, they can and want to play these 5 roles, which research shows will accelerate student learning. And so these 5 roles are communicating high expectations, monitoring the child's performance, supporting learning at home, guiding the child's education, and advocating for their child. And so we really believe that all parents are capable and want to play those roles in their child's life and education. And so we have some videos that we'll drop in the chat in a bit that show you kind of what we mean when we talk about these roles and how they kind of come to life when families are playing them. And I think I'll kick it back to Dimelza.
Thank you, Sophie. So as you go back one slide, Katie, real quick. So as we look at those roles, those all are played differently by different families. So if you think really about how your families communicated high expectations to you, how they monitored, like your performance when you were in school, how they supported your learning at home, they all look different. And so now you can go to the next slide. So keeping that in mind, and so as we think about how to support families so that they can be best positioned to play those roles, we have a particular framework that we use. And that framework is called Funds of Knowledge. In a nutshell, Funds of Knowledge says that people are competent and have knowledge, and their life experiences have given them that knowledge. So everyone has a base of knowledge, everyone has a base of assets. And what this really translates to into practice when it comes to family engagement is that all families have the skills, the beliefs, and the resources that are valuable to teaching and learning at home and in school. So let's delve a little bit deeper into this Funds of Knowledge framework, so you understand where it comes from. So the Funds of Knowledge framework comes from research. It was done by a group of academics, school teachers, and anthropologists back in the 90s. The primary purpose of this research was to innovate teaching and pedagogy by drawing on knowledge and skills found in the students' households. So things like their family's occupations, their healing methods, our family activity rituals that they had. This research was done in Tucson, Arizona, where there is still a large Mexican community. And what their findings made clear is that all families, regardless of culture, have knowledge and resources that should be leveraged in school because it enhances student learning. So with this approach in particular, it helps us really view our students and our families as people who have assets, people who are not seen as poor or deficient in any sense. They are bringing something to the table, and it is our job as educators to really challenge those deficit-based beliefs to serve families. So on the screen, you can see some examples of funds of knowledge. So as I mentioned, family occupations, healing methods, caregiving styles. So all those look different from family to family. and that has information. So for example, like when I was growing up, my family's like funds of knowledge when it came to caregiving styles. It was that because my mom was a single mom, and I was like the oldest daughter. I like supported in that sense. So I supported my siblings, I supported my mother, and so when I went into the classroom, it really helped me that my teachers acknowledged the level of independence I needed to make decisions about my education, and they brought my family along to have those conversations. So my teachers like knew that there is like a level of there's a different dynamic to the caregiving and to the conversations around my education that they needed to have with my family. So let's pause here for a second and think back to any specific memories that you have around your own funds of knowledge. And if you saw those reflected in your schools when you were a student. So let's take a minute to do that. And you can enter your reflections in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. We're a small group. I see people typing. Anyone else? Anyone wants to unmute while folks are typing?
I'm willing to go.
Mhm.
My name is Monique Baker from Communities and Schools. I grew up in a multi-generational household. Um, so I think we really benefited from, I grew up with my aunt and my grandmother and under one household. And so if somebody didn't know something, there was always somebody who knew, um, or you had support to sort of figure it out. So we had really strong familial bonds and a really strong informal support system, which benefited all of us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing.
Mhm.
And we also have in the chat another example about um, healing methods. So I encourage you to read that in the chat. And please keep adding in the chat. So really, ultimately, what we really want to draw with like funds of knowledge is that all of our families have skills, beliefs, and resources, and they just look different because families look different. They have different practices, and it's our job to it's our job to meet families where they are. So with that, I am moving to the next slide, Katie. Thank you. So with that in mind, really funds of knowledge is a framework that helps us like tackle biases and beliefs. So if we think through all the different ways that our own funds of knowledge, how those interacted with school, that helps us build more compassion towards families and more understanding towards families, which then help us tackle our biases and beliefs. And so examining those beliefs about families is a critical component of real family engagement. So when educators operate with asset-based beliefs about families, they're more likely to build successful academic partnerships with families because we're seeing them as partners who have a stake in their child's education. Conversely, when educators operate with deficit-based beliefs about families, they're more likely to limit communication and information sharing, thus limiting the ability of families to play the roles that we discussed earlier. So there are some negative beliefs about families, and let me phrase that again. So on the screen, you see some negative beliefs about families and how they're influenced by biases. So if you see that particular one that we highlighted, like in blue, that one is a sweeping generalization, like my students' families aren't invested in their child's learning. That is just a sweeping generalization. We'll tackle the other ones in a minute. And so when these thoughts or beliefs come up, there are some key questions that you can ask yourself or you can ask others to really challenge those assumptions. So, and these questions come from our longtime partner at like the Flamboyant Foundation. And we have a tool for that that we'll share in a minute. But if we hear this sweeping generalization, this bias, my students' families aren't invested in their child's learning, we can ask questions like, what assumptions are being made about investment here? Like, what does that look like? How would this belief impact your actions or my actions when interacting with the families? And what would you ask yourself or someone else to challenge that particular assumption? Anything else on this slide, Sophie, that you wanted to add?
I think no, I think we can work through it on the next slide, and show people the tool from Flamboyant and how they would be using it for this kind of a statement, right?
Yeah,
Um,
excellent.
yeah, I think that's great.
Thank you. All right. So let's look at the next slide. And this is so we'll share the tools already in the chat. There are many other examples there, and you could work through like sweeping generalizations that you have heard, or like negative or deficit-based beliefs that you have heard about families with this tool. This one is just like a quick example with that sweeping generalization that we saw in the previous slide. Families aren't invested here. So what assumptions are being made about what it takes or what it looks like, what it sounds like to support a child's learning? So here we see that investment is when families attend school events, participate in PTO, volunteer to chaperone. If parents aren't doing these things, then they're not invested. So that's what this negative belief about families says about what investment looks like. How could this belief potentially impact educators' actions? So if educators believe that families aren't invested, um, if we operate from this belief, we might see educators like limit the communication and information sharing with families. They might just like stop trying to engage with them altogether, because the definition of investment is a very specific definition that they have. And if families are not showing up that way, they're like, well, they don't care. And here's some questions to ask to really tackle this assumption. So we could ask questions like, what are some of the invisible investments families might be making in their child's schooling? Who is this for, and how is this? Excuse me. Who is this true for, and how do you know? Because there are a lot of things that we just don't might not see that are happening at home. What would happen if we say this to families? If we say like we have this belief about you that they're not invested, like would they agree with that statement? Would they be upset by it? Like, and what reasons my families have for not showing up in the ways that as educators like we have defined in that second column, right? So this is like a way to really tackle this negative beliefs about families. So we'll go to the next slide. So we talked about the sweeping generalization one. My students' families aren't invested in their child's learning. So now let's practice a little bit with this particular approach. So now you see highlighted in blue 3 different types of negative beliefs about family. So we have like a deficit beliefs. So families can't or won't support their child's education. We have blaming. If this family did their part, my job wouldn't be so hard. And we have closing off possibilities. I've tried contacting that family several times and never get a response. it's been easier if it's easier if I just work around them. So now in the chat, or you can become unmuted, let's tackle these different beliefs. So let's start with the first question. What assumptions are being made about what investment looks like? And the beliefs that are highlighted in blue.
On the second one, the blaming, it's framed through the teacher's job, which I think is interesting. Like they're centered. The teacher's needs are centered in that statement, that their perception that the family isn't involved is making their job harder, and that's the problem. So I think that's interesting. Like the student isn't even in that statement.
Thank you for sharing, Abby.
I think the last one, closing off possibilities, I think there's the assumption that they don't have other competing priorities. You know, it might be work, it might be several other kids, or a kid that might be younger or has more needs. You don't know.
Thank you. And
this-
what? Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say for the third one, I think it also makes an assumption about family structure. Because I know I've had families that I've gone to principals and been like, I can't reach so and so. I've called mom and dad like 10 times, and they're like, have you called grandma? Grandma picks up on the first ring. So like understanding who is family, or what is the family structure.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. So let's like tackle this a little bit deeper with the next question. How would these beliefs like potentially impact educator actions? So if a educator believe those things, what am I do or not do when it comes to family engagement?
I can share something that I've noticed and that teachers have shared with me is sometimes the having a negative belief, the risk of that becoming almost like a rumor about the family, and that information traveling around like in the school, and staff sharing certain negative beliefs about families based on their own personal biases or individual interactions that they had. And so part of our training with our teachers, and I think something that we would want to stress for you all too, and for everyone really, is just to focus on your your lived reality, and what you know to be true, and limiting if you hear, you know, certain things that are being said about families, negative beliefs, and you just can't, if that isn't from your lived experience, just staying away from that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing, Sophie. We also see that when educators hold those beliefs about families, we really see that break in partnership that exists. Um, Educators might stop trying to form academic partnerships with families. They might not share information that families need to play those active roles in their child's education. And ultimately, they would really like hold the family back from really engaging and being part of their child's education. So let's do the last part of this particular framework, which is what would you ask if you hear someone say this? What would you ask them? Or if you have this thought come to your mind, what would you ask yourself to challenge this assumption? And you can choose any of the three assumptions highlighted in blue. I should say I used to teach English as a second language, so I'm really good with wait time. I'm very comfortable with silence. Thank you for sharing the chat, Abby.
this might be an odd question, but how often, or is it also sometimes worth reflecting on whether or not you are the right messenger for a particular message? So, if that family has a particular relationship with somebody at school, or they don't feel comfortable with you for whatever reason, is there space to think about whether or not you should be delivering a particular message, or whether leveraging another relationship is a better strategy?
Mhm. Yeah, I feel like there is power in leveraging relationships because, family is like we're people, we like bond to different people differently if we see like we relate to each other. And still like every educator needs to like build that relationship with their child, with their students' families. I think it's like and both. I think having like leveraging that relationship is a really like great like entryway to establish like your own relationship with a family. And we see a couple more questions coming in. The reflecting on how we're defining support or families doing their part. That's really important. How that's defined and making sure that it's not a definition that we're putting on families, right? Think back on those like funds of knowledge that support to families from families to their children like looks different based on their own funds of knowledge. Um, how are we communicating with families? Yes, thinking through like what is gonna be the best for that family. Um, asking families what works for them. And I liked the question Natalie entered that because I mean I was a teacher and when I was like a first year teacher, like I did hear some teachers making like negative comments about families, but I was like really scared. I didn't know what to do or say, so I would just like walk out of like the copy room. But I think in those moments, just even asking like, why do you think that is such a good way of really helping folks like tease out that negative belief.
I heard someone say, and I can't remember where this is from, it's like 5 whys. It's like if you ask why like 5 times is how you get to like the actual root. So if you say like, okay, so let's say the first one, families can't or won't support their child's education. Why do you think that? They don't show up to parent teacher conferences. Why might they not show up to parent teacher conferences? And then like you ask that 5 times until you get to like what might be like the root of the assumption.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that, Natalie. Yes, I also like heard that, the 5 whys. Excellent.
I also think like leading with empathy is very important. Like before you make a bad phone call home, put yourself in that parent's shoes. Like if this is your third call from the school saying your kid did something, instead of leading with this is what they did, you might if you were in their shoes, you might say, like, what can I do to support? Or like, I think leading with empathy could help a lot.
Thank
Or
you.
asking what kind of support might be needed, like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And that's a perfect segue to kick it off to Sophie. Sophie will talk to us about ongoing communication a little bit more. And as like Sophie's talking about that and you reflect on what we've discussed, just keep in mind that, biases are stories that we make up about people before we truly know them. And to get to know them, we need to have that ongoing communication. So I'll kick it off to Sophie.
Great, thanks. Thanks Dimelza and thanks Monique. This truly was the perfect segue. So we are going to focus on ongoing communication, but just wanting to zoom out first and contextualize this for you. Not sure how familiar, well, not some of you seem more familiar with family engagement than others, so just want to remember to give the full picture. At DCPS, when we talk specifically about family engagement practices, we're talking about these 3 practices on the slide. So academic partnering, ongoing communication, and trusting relationships. We have some key strategies that we see as gold standards for with in these practices at DCPS. So I'm sure all of you have heard about home visits. That's our gold standard when it comes to relationship building at DCPS, is relationship building visits happening at the home or in the community. And so if you work in a school that is partnered with the Flamboyant Foundation, their staff are most likely going on home visits, especially at the beginning of the year. When we think about academic partnering, it's really more focused on collaborating with families on their students' growth on academics, but also well-being, social-emotional attendance. And that, should be happening year-round, but obviously one example is, of course, parent-teacher conferences. And then there's ongoing communication, which really is like the glue that holds it all together. And that's what we need. That's what our team has been focusing on in the last year or so, is ensuring that we're supporting schools so that they can have meaningful ongoing communication with their students and families. And we felt like this would probably be of interest to this audience as well. So next slide, please. And there you go. Thank you, Katie. When we talk about ongoing communication at DCPS, what are our best practices? What do we train our staff on? And what do we recommend that you all kind of keep top of mind as well? So I would love first, before I give a quick overview of each of these, if maybe one or two people could either in the chat or come off mute and share an example. You can pick whichever one you want on the slide. What do you have an example on what this practice could look like or sound like in action? So on the slide we have, I'll read it if there's anyone who's not looking at the screen. We have positive framing, consistent, two-way, differentiated and culturally responsive, and student-centered. Those are our best practices, if anyone wants to share an example for one.
I can share an example for positive framing. We had one student in our program who having trouble sitting and focusing for like academic things. And so we moved him into the class the year younger. So he was a third grader. We moved him with second grade and made him the executive helper. And sharing that with families, we were able, or with his family, being like, hey, like he has so much knowledge and he's like so energetic, he's able to go around and help hand out things and help the second graders with their homework, and like he's supporting his classmates instead of focusing on like how he was so disruptive in the other classroom.
That's a great example. Thank you so much for sharing. So really focusing on the strengths, right? Highlighting the wins, no matter how small, although that's not a small win. That's a big win to be like the captain, or what, I forget the term you use, but that's a big deal. So yes, absolutely. Throughout the course of the year, we encourage our teachers, our staff to think about this 5-to-1 ratio when it comes to communication. So for every negative communication or conversation that you might have to have with a family, having 5 positive interactions or communications with them beforehand. And again, this can be like very simple, like a quick text with a picture of your student who's finished an assignment they're proud of, a quick phone call to say hi. Positive framing goes a really long way and is really important for that relationship building piece. Consistent, fairly obvious. you don't build trust through one conversation. You don't go on one day and get married. This is something that you want to sustain so that families are used to hearing from you. And we tell our teachers ideally that they should reach out to, or that their students' parents should hear from them every 2 to 3 weeks. Two-way. The idea here really with two-way is that communication is not just one-sided from the school to the family. Families should feel comfortable reaching out to the school or the teacher, and they should be given opportunities to respond to communication. Obviously, for when we're thinking about differentiated and culturally responsive, the idea there is simple. We just want to meet our family's unique needs. And so an example, the best practice usually is just to ask. And even like we're saying with this assumptions activity, like just start by asking always what works best for the family. And the same applies for communication. And of course, the next level there is really ensuring equitable communication. So language access is very important. And I think you've gotten to meet with the language access division, and so they will have given you all the tools, but that's something that stands out in our PD as well. And then student-centered. Here, the idea really is that when we're talking about this communication, we're talking about individualized communication with families. So it's not that like class-wide text that's going to go out about early dismissal or the next field trip. It's that one-on-one communication with the family that is specific to the student. And I just want to say we're sharing all of this with you. We know that you're not like the primary adult in these students' kind of schooling experience. So just sharing with you, knowing that this is the training that we give our staff, and there are certainly some best practices to pull from here. And then the next slide, Dimelza is going to share how you can kind of potentially integrate into the school's communication systems.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. So for the next couple of slides, Sophie and I are going to share some resources to really implement the best practices that we discussed. I'll get started with establishing the two-way communication mechanism. So whenever we put out information to families, families should, or any communication, families should have the opportunity to respond to that communication. And if you want to take that to the next level, like have like a clear communication pathway between families and decision makers, especially decision makers in your organizations. There are 3 ways of doing this. So the first one is by making sure that as a team, as an organization, you have a platform that is consistent across the partnering staff. So for example, like back in my heyday, I worked for Higher Achievement. We worked in, when I was there, 8 different schools. Yeah, 8 different schools in the DC, Virginia, Maryland region. And so we just needed to have one way of communicating with our families. So families knew that if they were going to get any communication from center directors, from anyone who's like working with their children after school, it was going to be this particular way. So it could be something like everyone uses WhatsApp, or we have a WhatsApp group, something that is consistent. If you are working in a way that is more integrated with the school, with the schools that you're partnered with, it could be a school-based platform. So something that aligns with what the school leaders are using or teachers that are using, looking for ways to align with that, looking for ways to be integrated into the communication plan. So if you know that the school sends out like a newsletter like once a month, making sure that whatever is like you're aware of that newsletter day, when the content is due for that newsletter, to make sure that you're integrated with that you can also highlight that communication to families. And so that could be like school-based. For school-based, most schools use Remind, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but some schools don't, especially our elementary schools that might use something like Class Dojo, or there might be, I think there's like talking points that some of our schools are using. So really thinking through like, okay, the school is doing something, families know what to expect from their schools, and just jumping like on board with that, it helps align a little bit better. Now, a vast majority of our schools are using Remind. Right now, 100% of our schools are have at least one person in their building that is sending Remind messages through Remind platform. It used to be called Remind 101, if you're familiar with that back in the day. That is our district-based platform. Excuse me, I'm having a little cold. So that's our district-based platform. You can have access to Remind through your school's like point of contact. You can request that from them. The reason why we call this a district-based platform, it is because it is supported by central services. So I am the person who supports Remind. We support, and Natalie, who's in the call, also like supports Remind. Almost every day we're doing something Remind related. Making sure that school leaders have the resources, the training to send those messages, that teachers feel equipped to send those messages. We put out resources that are, could be used with any platform, but we design them specifically for Remind. And so if your school is using Remind, the way to get access to that is through your school's point of contact. And if you need any additional supports, I am the person to provide that support. The really cool thing with Remind is that every DCPS family and their student is already in the platform. So if you create a class, say like I see this for like DC scores a lot. For what's like the last one that I saw? It was like Kelly Miller, DC scores. They had a game, didn't go so well, and they're gonna have more practice. That message went out to families. And because it's supported by the district, I'm able to see it. It was, a way to share with families information about their child's performance. I think they included something about like talk to your child about, what it means to continue working when things didn't work out for you. So a way to build like that SCL competency like at home with families. And again, like more than happy to support it with that, but please touch base with your school point of contact for that. So that is the two-way communication mechanism. I'll pass it off to Sophie to talk about two more resources that we have for you.
Cool. Thanks, Dimelza. If we could go to the next slide. Thanks, Katie. So we shared lots of tools and best practices. Wanted to share some more guidance and resources. We know that a lot, and this is where it would be helpful to chime in if you're interested in sharing kind of the context that you're navigating. But a lot of the communication guidance that we shared so far was really focused on proactive and positive communication. And of course, like we hope that most of the communication between families and schools are positive, but we know that reactive communication is a real part of this work as well. Sometimes that is neutral. It's just following up on something. And sometimes it's negative. There was an accident, there was an incident, something happened. And we figured that in your roles, you are probably coming across this kind of a scenario more often than making like proactive communication action plans with like teachers, because you're not employed by DCPS. You're not that primary adult in that child's learning experience, but you do interact with students and families. And we know that sometimes something will happen after school during a program, and here is a protocol that you can use if you need to kind of navigate a situation with a family. I will also say that before diving into this, always check with your school admin, like what the protocol is at your school to handle an incident and communicate with the family. Abby also probably has some like compliance considerations for you. But generally, here's a helpful protocol. Starting with getting the facts. So I think someone on this call had said that sometimes you might not be the best person to have the conversation, or you might not have all the information you need. So really working with your colleagues in your program and also with the DCPS staff to make sure that all the facts are there. Prepare action steps before you meet. So what outcomes would you like to see? What needs to happen in order to get there? And then having that conversation with the parent, always thanking them for prioritizing this, for attending, presenting the facts, just the facts, not your kind of interpretation, and really pausing for a response and being really intentional about listening. So not listening to hear and not to respond. And based on the response, there are usually two ways you can go. So if this is your kind of level of area of expertise, you can offer a solution. If you've maybe talked with a school and you all have identified a solution that you want to suggest to the family, or if it feels like more of a back and forth is needed, and they have a strong viewpoint or something, ask first, what their idea is around how to resolve this issue. Agreeing on next steps once you've reached a resolution is really important, and discussing how you will be monitoring the progress. And again, going back to that consistency, following up, and just, keeping that empathy, as someone mentioned, keeping that top of mind, just being open-minded, being kind, but obviously taking care of yourself if, you're in a situation that is triggering for whatever reason. So we only have a few minutes left, and so I will quickly, if we could go to the next slide. I just want to highlight that we have a toolkit. It's an ongoing communication toolkit that really highlights everything that we just shared with you all and more. There are a few things in here that we think could be helpful for you all. Some scripts that have been written by DCPS teachers that you can kind of use, plug and go to communicate with families. Reminder of these important language access tools that we have, and just generally some tips and best practices for tracking communication and overcoming common barriers. So with that being said, if we can go to the next slide, you'll see our contact information on here and all the places where you can find us online. We have some great family-facing content through our Parent University channel on YouTube. That is something that Dimelza leads. And so you can find live sessions, pre-recorded sessions, both in English and Spanish on there. So yeah, please reach out to us if you have any questions about any of this. I'm not sure if we have time for any questions. We have like 3 minutes left, but I'm happy to answer any questions if people have them right now.
Yeah, if anyone has a burning question, feel free to
burning
a
question.
burning question.
And if not, you know how to reach us. We're always happy to partner.
Yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out. You also have our email address, so if you have a question that you want us to pass along, happy to do that. Like I've said, this session was recorded, so we will be posting it on our partnerships website. So encourage you to share it with your colleagues, as well as all the links to the resources. And so if nobody has a question that they want to chat through now, we can give you all back 2 minutes in your day, and just appreciate everyone taking your lunch break with us. And big shout out to Dimelza and Sophie for putting this together for us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you.